Hello and welcome to your second attachment lesson. Today we're going to be going over what we learned about last lesson and evaluating those concepts. So as a starter, what I want you to do is firstly bullet point 3 details of Melstoff and Moore's procedure, summarise in one sentence why imitation behaviours are thought to be innate. If you remember last lesson, we discussed whether it's real imitation that we see in infants or whether it's pseudo-imitation. And then I want you to define reciprocity in fewer than 10 words and do the same for interactional synchrony. So just pause me now and have a go at doing that just to really refresh your memories of what we learned about last lesson. So Melstoff and Moore, you only need 3 of these, but let me tell you briefly what they did, and if you got 3 of these, then you give yourself 3 marks. They showed babies 3 faces and 1 hand gesture, and then they recorded the infant's responses. The observers watched these on videotapes in real time, then they watched them in slow motion and frame by frame. And then the videos were judged independently by an observer who didn't know what the infant had seen. This was really important for the validity of the study, because then you know that they're really measuring this interaction between caregiver and infant rather than just what the infants are doing. And they used the following categories: mouth opening, termination of mouth opening, tongue protrusion, and termination of tongue protrusion. Summarise in one sentence why imitation behaviours are thought to be innate. You could have said how Melstoff and Moore found evidence of imitation in babies as young as 3 days old. So they didn't really have time to learn by the time they're 3 days old. So Melstoff and Moore concluded that that behaviour must be innate. You could have also spoken about Murray and Trevethan, who studied 2-month-old infants. And they first interacted with a video monitor where the mum was in real time, and then the video monitor just played the clip back. And when it was just playing the clip back and the mother wasn't responding to the infant, it caused a lot of distress in the infants, and it eventually led to them losing interest because their goal of attracting their mum's attention had failed. Reciprocity, I think I've got more than 10 words here, but where an infant responds to the actions of another person, I'll accept that, where an infant responds to the actions of another person, or you could have said when the actions of one person elicits a response from the other. Interactional synchrony is where the infant mirrors the actions of another person. Before I talk to you about some of the evaluations, can you think of any problems with studying infants? And this is something that you might be able to use in further topics of attachment, because a lot of them do research on infants. So what are some of the problems with studying infants? And this relates to the first evaluation that I want to look at. So as I go through these 5 evaluation points, I don't want you to write it out word for word. I want you to write it up in note format. I have written them out as peels for you today, just so we can really see how we can get these full marks for evaluation and how we need to explain our points and how much evidence we need as well. So our first point is a limitation, and a limitation of research into caregiver interaction. So there we clearly state whether it's a limitation or a strength, and we clearly state what we're actually evaluating. And the problem with it is that there are issues and difficulties with testing infant behaviour. Evidence of this is that infants' mouths are in fairly constant motion, and the expressions tested occur frequently. This could mean that behaviours are occurring just generally and not in relation to a stimulus. Basically, babies are random and they do whatever they want. So they might not actually, there's no way to actually know whether they're reacting to something, because they can't tell us they might just be performing natural behaviour. So why is this a weakness? Why is this a weakness of research into caregiver interactions? It means that researchers may not be measuring infants' behaviour and they might just be measuring infants' behaviour and not their engagement with interactional synchrony or reciprocity, which lowers the internal validity of the study. Remember, internal validity is all to do with whether we're measuring what we intended to measure. And because we might not be measuring that, it lowers the internal validity. So there in the explanation, I've got an evaluation issue, so validity, and I've also related it back to what we're actually evaluating, which is interactional synchrony and reciprocity. However, how did Melstoff and Moore combat this? So how did they increase their internal validity and their reliability? So they did this in a few ways, but because they filmed infants and asked an independent observer who had no idea what the infant had seen, that means that they were just collecting data based on what they were seeing. They didn't know the aim of the study, therefore that increases the internal validity of the data. Their methods were also good because they tested for intra and inter-observer reliability. So you could write this as a double whopper. So you'd write your PEE as normal, bring in some contradictory evidence, and then come to some sort of conclusion. So at the end of this, you could say, therefore, the internal validity may be low, but researchers have found ways to combat this, for example. Our next evaluation point is another weakness. And a weakness is that research hasn't very widely been replicated. And I want you to consider now, what issues do you think we're going to talk about in our explanation? What clearly relates to replicability? So evidence comes from Kopke, and they failed to replicate Melstoff and Moore's findings. Merriam et al. Replicated Murray and Trevathan's study, but infants could not distinguish between live and videotaped interactions with their mothers. So Merriam et al. Found that the infants weren't distressed when they realised that they weren't getting the attention of the mother. So basically, the findings of previous research hasn't been replicated. So obviously, this gives us issues with reliability. Replicability equals reliability, because reliability is all to do with consistency and being able to replicate your results. So this suggests infants are not actually responding to the adults and are showing natural behaviour. This lowers the reliability of research, as later studies have been unable to replicate the results. So here I've clearly linked it back to research into caregiver interactions, and then I've given you an evaluation issue and explained it. So don't just say, therefore this means that it's less reliable. Well, why is it less reliable? It's because we haven't been able to replicate findings. Our third point is another weakness, and it's something that I want to explain, something called intentionality. And all that means is whether you intend to do something, whether something is intentional. So this intentionality of infant behaviour has been questioned by research. Evidence of this comes from Abravanel and de Jong, who observed infant behaviour when interacting with two inanimate objects. So they were no longer interacting with a caregiver or even another human. They were two inanimate objects, and one of them stimulated tongue movements and the other stimulated opening and closing of the mouth. And they tested infants with a median age of 5 and 12 weeks, so very, very young babies. And all of these infants made very little response to the objects, so they weren't imitating these objects as they had live models. So what does this mean? This means that the research is less useful, so it lowers the usefulness of caregiver-infant interactions definitions, as it shows that infants do not just imitate anything they see. It is specific to social response to other humans. So therefore, all the research done, Melstoff and Moore, etc., is less useful because it can't explain infant behaviour fully. And I'm going to do this evaluation issue a little bit differently to give you some practice. So I'm going to show you the evidence first, and then I want you to try and come up with a point and an explanation. And there's two ways you could look at this evidence. So Isabella et al. Found that more strongly attached infant caregiver pairs showed greater interactional synchrony. Hyman showed that infants who demonstrate a lot of imitation from birth onwards have a better quality of relationship at 3 months. So what could you write as a point or as an explanation? I'll give you a clue. You could write it as a strength, or you could write it as a weakness, depending on how you see this research. So pause me now and have a go at writing a point and an explanation. So I wrote it as a weakness, but I'll explain in a sec how you could have written it as a strength. One limitation of research into interactional synchrony is that individual differences aren't taken into account. So all babies are different. Not all of them interact in the same way. And this means that Melstoff and Moore's findings cannot be generalised to every infant, which lowers the application of findings. When results are generalisable, they're useful because it means that we can generalise them to the whole target population. But this one we can't because there are individual differences which aren't taken into account within this research. However, you could say that this is a strength because research such as that done by Isabella and Hyman can be used to advise parents to encourage imitation, because babies who show less imitation may not develop strong attachments in future. So a strength is that research into caregiver-infant interaction has practical applications. And if something has practical applications, it means that it's useful, and it has explanatory power as well because we can explain real life behaviour. So that could be your explanation if you wanted to write it as a strength. Last evaluation issue I want to talk to you about is a strength. And a strength of research into caregiver-infant interactions is that it explains how children begin to understand what others think and feel. Melstoff, after his research on interactional synchrony, went on to develop a like-me hypothesis. And there were 3 steps in this. The first step that he believed infants did was that they made a connection between what they see and their imitation of this. From this imitation, infants were able to associate their own acts and their own underlying mental states. So, for example, if they see someone smiling and they imitate this, then they associate that with their underlying mental state of happiness, for example. And this allows them to project their own internal experiences onto others performing similar acts. So then they can later recognise, oh, that person's smiling, they must be happy. Therefore, it's helping them build this understanding of what others are thinking and feeling. And this is a very famous part of psychology. It's called the theory of mind. And what the theory of mind is basically an assessment of an individual's degree of capacity for empathy and understanding of other people. And it's said that people with autism, for example, have a lack of theory of mind. So they're not able to maybe empathise or understand other people's emotions and thoughts as well as people who have theory of mind. This matters because it shows research into interactional synchrony has given us fundamental understanding for how humans form social relationships. and it gives the theory, again, practical applications. We can use this to encourage parents to encourage their infants to imitate them, because it has a lot of social benefits later on. And just to finish, what I want you to do, because you've taken in a lot of information, I want you to draw a picture for each of the 5 evaluations we have discussed. So I don't want to suggest any pictures for you to draw, because I want them to be personal to you, which will make you more likely to remember these evaluation issues. So the ones that we've discussed are the problems with testing infants, the findings that can't be replicated, intentionality, individual differences / generalizability, and theory of mind, so how it allows us to develop social understanding. So have a go at doing that. I'm looking forward to seeing your pictures. Please upload onto Teams and let me know if you have any questions.